Riddle me this, what has 8 cores but sometimes more? What tops the benchmark scores but costs soar? What can sometimes be a 9 but also a 7? Well, of course, it's the Ryzen RIDDLE 9950X3D, where in today's video we are disabling 8 of the cores, the non-X3D cores, and then tuning that up and comparing it against the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. And also with the 9800X3D, we're going to be locking in the plus 200 megahertz, minus 20 steps on the curve optimizer to get the most performance out of this CPU, as well as doing that on the Ryzen RIDDLE. So if you love learning everything about these chips, including an undervolted and underclocked scenario, then this video is going to be for you. The one thing I will say, after looking at today's results, I do understand why AMD locks down the X3D chips and limits them more in terms of tuning versus other variants of CPUs, say for instance the non-X3D 9700X or the Ryzen 7 7700. So in today's video, we are testing in a sandbox on Windows 11 IoT LTSC. I thought I'd give this a run for today's video, even though some of the results will be better on Windows 10 Pro and whatnot. I want to keep things apples to apples in this regard. And we're also testing with that RTX 5090 to extract the biggest extreme differences, if there are any, in these titles at 1080p low settings, where we're stressing the CPU as much as possible. It will start off with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and here's where the custom clocked Ryzen 7 9800X3D does the best with plus 200 megahertz and minus 20 steps. It's not just that 0.1% low though, it's also the average FPS. It gains a bump here over the default, and I feel like the Ryzen RIDDLE, it's on default value, it does pretty well, but it's not the Silicon Lottery winner, and we'll talk about that more later, where the plus 200 megahertz profile and the minus 20 steps here actually does worse for 0.1% lows, but wins with average FPS. Now, what I mean by the PBO plus 200 megahertz and the minus 20 steps, this is generally a recommended tune for these CPUs. I can get, for instance, the Ryzen 9950X3D to minus 30 steps, but it doesn't make a difference. At minus 20 steps, we're getting the most we can out of this configuration, and the Ryzen 7 9800X3D is the same scenario here. But keep in mind, the more you minus off the stepping in the BIOS here, the more you are likely to come into instability. And so I find anywhere from minus 10 to minus 30 is going to be the range that most people fall into when they're trying to get a custom PBO tune for their system. And of course, we are using a really good water cooler, power supply, and motherboard. So the CPUs I tend to test fall more towards that minus 30 steps. Though back to the Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 numbers themselves, if you've got a Ryzen 7 9800X3D, you're really missing out on nothing versus the more expensive and then manually cut down the cores 9950X3D. So let's move on to the next game here, which is pretty interesting, but we'll do that right after today's video sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by boot.dev, and have you ever wanted to learn programming but find yourself reading code or writing code with very little understanding of the context? If this is you and you want to learn in a fun and exciting way, then boot.dev has the perfect solution for those who want to actually learn coding. It's kind of like the Mavis Beacon teaches typing, and yes, this is how I learned to type back in the day for back-end development. So if you want to learn things like Python, Golang, or Squeal, then there are full interactive courses for that, and the salaries in this industry alone top over 100K a year USD on average. So as I was scrolling through these courses, I noticed they had Linux there, and recently the channel had been pretty big on Linux, so I immediately jumped into this as soon as I saw the option. However, in total, there's also 20 full courses available with an XP leveling system where you can essentially like quest and join the global leaderboards if you wish to compete and fast track your learning. Though the best part about today's video sponsor is that it's completely free to read and watch the courses. Though if you want to do the interaction part, that's where you may need to sign up for a course. And here's some good news here. If you're a Tech Yes City viewer, you can use the link in the description below and the coupon code TechYesCity for a full 25% discount off the annual subscription courses. So what are you guys waiting for? I'll put the links in the description below. Let's get back to the video. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and next up we've got Counter-Strike 2, where the PBO-tuned Ryzen 7 9800X3D does a great job here, and our default Ryzen RIDDLE does well. You'll notice the undervolted and underclocked 4800 megahertz is keeping up on the 0.1% lows here. But this isn't the case for other games. The average FPS, it also takes a big hit here in this particular scenario. The 9950X3D with the PBO tune plus 200 megahertz does do quite well here, but again, it's nothing special for where we need it, those 0.1% lows. So again, Ryzen 7 9800X3D owners are probably feeling great at this point in time. Though let's move on to Baldur's Gate 3, and this game made me understand why these X3D chips in particular are locked. And this game just gave us a lot of information because it seems like there is a balance between higher clock speeds and of course not running too high or too low of a clock speed. Then there's potentially intercore heat and performance, and looking at that 8-core 9950X3D result on PBO plus 200 megahertz with the 0.1% lows, yeah, check out that massive dip. It's almost like the X3D cache isn't even working. Then if we thought, okay, well maybe it's just clocked too high, the undervolted 4.8 gigahertz churns out an absolute turd of a result here too. So basically the X3D chips are extremely sensitive to voltage changes and clock speed levels, especially those that are in sync with the X3D cache timings. So the default Ryzen 9950X3D 8-core setting, which comes very close to the Ryzen 7 9800X3D at plus 200 megahertz, and the default Ryzen 7 9800X3D are doing all great in this benchmark, kind of indicating some kind of sweet spot here for those 9000 X3D cores. The next game to look at here is Fortnite, and here's where besides not being able to set manual core affinity in this game, the results just aren't that exciting. The average FPS is very similar actually from configuration to configuration, and the 0.1% lows in this game are particularly all over the place. However, if we look at the previous video of the Ryzen 7 7700, the X3D cache itself, I believe, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this title. And also those 0.1% lows are a lot better, even though they're kind of inconsistent, they're a lot better than the non-X3D variants. And I think this is most likely due to the Unreal Engine 5 here being generally considered an unoptimized starter fest. Heading over to Marvel Rivals now, this is probably the game in today's benchmarks where we've just got that burger and it's got two buns. We just grab the two buns, slam them together, no sauce in the middle, no patties, nothing. The proverbial nothing burger has reared its head here, but if we learned anything from the Ryzen 7 7700 results, we can see here that this game is actually quite non-X3D cached Ryzen CPU friendly, so I'm not surprised to see that there's not a huge difference between all the different configurations. Though, let's move on to the final game now, and this is Riftbreaker, and here is on Windows 11 IoT LTSC. Nothing to really be gained here outside of a few extra FPS, whether it's on the 0.1% lows or the average FPS, and the top three candidates in the previous benchmarks, they're performing again consistently at the top of the graphs. Though, our final graph for you guys is the power consumption, and here's where we mainly have a boost in the from-the-wall power inferenced from the higher FPS that the RTX 5090 is pushing relative to the configuration used, and well, mainly to the FPS that's being brought out because the RTX 5090 is having to work harder. And that 4.8 gigahertz, however, if it wasn't for that Baldur's Gate 3 result with sloppy 0.1% lows, it would have impressed me actually with its significantly lower power draw. Anyhow, guys, with all those results out of the way, what are we looking at exactly here with the Ryzen RIDDLE 9950X3D? And for me personally, I'm looking at a CPU that out of the box on its default settings will have a higher tuned clock speed that AMD knows is within that range of giving out pretty good performance. The problem is once we start doing the PBO tune and disabling 8 of the cores, we get results that are kind of inconsistent, which means that the CPU is just getting clocked too high relative to how it wants to perform in relation to utilizing its X3D cache on the CPU. So what this means is if you've got a Ryzen 7 9800X3D and you want that extra performance thinking, well, the extra clock speeds from the 9950X3D is going to give me that extra edge, well, you've also got that plus 200 megahertz PBO tune in the BIOS that you can do that actually works amazingly well on the 9800X3D. As opposed to the 9950X3D, it doesn't work so well. Now, there is one more thing that I will talk about in this video, and that is manually clocking the X3D 9000 series chips and seeing what you can get out of them. And this is where I hinted at earlier in the video with the silicon I think, being not really binned on the 9950X3D, at least for the X3D portion of the CPU. And the reason I say this is because I actually was able to manually clock the CPU itself to 5.7 gigahertz at around 1.33 volts, which I honestly don't want to take it any higher than these voltage levels. But the funny thing is I achieved very similar stability levels and clock speeds to that of my 9800X3D with the same manual tuning. The problem is with these manual clock speeds, when you want to go to 5.7 gigahertz, for instance, if you come into a program that then utilizes, say, AVX2 instruction sets, your whole PC is just going to crash instantly. And even in some games, if they utilize these heavier instruction sets, you're going to see your PC just crash at this 5.7 gigahertz level. And so it's really the manual tuning here can't really be of use to anyone unless you're willing to accept the AVX2 stable clock speed on manual, which is generally lower than the default clock speeds for the X3D chips. And then if you're wondering, well, what about an AVX2 offset? I know that's a thing in the past with certain Intel CPUs. Apparently with AMD, you just can't do an AVX2 offset. And basically that is when you say lock in 5.7 gigahertz manual speed, and you say, well, if I'm running AVX2 instruction sets, drop it off 500 megahertz and set it to 5.2 gigahertz manual. And for me personally, I actually would love to see this come in with the Ryzen AMD setups on AM5, especially in the BIOS, and have that ability so I could manually tune my CPU. Say, for instance, you want to lock in a 5.6 gigahertz manual speed for your Ryzen 7 9800X3D while you're playing games, but then have, say, an AVX offset of 400 megahertz and go down to 5.2 gigahertz while you're running Cinebench or doing your workflow that needs AVX2 instructions. You can't do that because there's no AVX2 offset in the BIOS. So really, when all is said and done here, from my analysis, I can tell you that the Ryzen 7 9800X3D is already tuned pretty well out of the box. AMD have done a good job of tuning this thing for pretty much everyone out there that wants to get good gaming performance. But with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, I would play around with the PBO tune in the BIOS, especially if you've got a B650 motherboard or a B850 or greater. In terms of your chipset, you'll be able to actually do this in the BIOS and manually tune with the PBO settings. It's actually a pretty easy thing. I would recommend starting off with -10 steps and then just go from there, maybe plus 100 megahertz. And then after that, you can try plus 200 megahertz, -20 steps. But this would be a great starting area just to eke out a little extra performance out of your Ryzen 7 9800X3D. However, for a 9950X3D, I wouldn't bother going out and buying this CPU and then disabling 8 of the cores, thinking that it's going to be the best silicon ever, because all I'm seeing here is just a sort of a firmware, a different firmware on the CPU that's giving it out of the box, more or less, that Ryzen 7 9800X3D PBO tune that we just talked about moments before. And so you're getting that slight extra performance out of the box. But then if you want to disable 8 of the cores on the 9950X3D and then take it to an even higher level, you start getting some inconsistent performance. And that's what I'm seeing here. So unfortunately, I don't believe you're actually getting better X3D silicon on the 9950X3D. Though in closing today's video, I would say that from what I've seen here today, the X3D chips, they're much more sensitive to clock speeds. And on that note, voltages, but also the voltages can be related to the heat as well. So very sensitive CPUs, and I can understand why AMD's locked them down for the better part and kept them very limited in how you can tune them, because I guess they don't want people getting bad performance after doing some settings and messing some settings up in the BIOS and then saying, okay, my CPU's crap, what's going on here, as opposed to just locking it down and saying, hey, just enjoy this thing. I think in this case, because it's such a sensitive CPU, it's probably a better way to do things. But that being said, I would love to see that AVX2 offset. I think that'd be a really cool thing just to have a bit of fun with one day. And the last thing is, I thought coming into this video, maybe I could have a cool custom test bed with the Ryzen RIDDLE going forward, but really the test bed system going forward will probably just feature the 9800X3D with a PBO tune and some very tight timings on the DDR5, especially when we're looking at high performance benchmarks for graphics cards and things like that. So in a nutshell, if you're looking for the best gaming performance, there's really no need to go out and buy the 9950X3D. Just stick with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, save some money, and lock in a very quick and easy to do PBO tune. Anyhow, guys, with that aside, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Also, if you have any questions or comments about today's video, be sure to drop a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one. And also, if you stayed this far, of course, and you're enjoying that tech-yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.